My first night in the psychiatric clinic was oppressive. The silence was almost unnatural and felt as if it were tangible. There were moments when I felt that the darkness in the room was alive, as if it were moving towards me. In the room there was only a faint night light that bathed the walls in a pale glow. The sound of my own breath was the only thing that reminded me I was still awake. An uneasy feeling spread within me, as if I had lost not only my mind but also my sense of reality. Suddenly I heard a whisper. It was quiet, barely perceptible, but it sounded as if it came from the walls themselves. I lay still listening, but there was only the silence and the incessant rhythm of my racing heart. The next morning I began to explore the hospital. The corridors were long, dark, and seemed to stretch into infinity. Pictures of patients and staff hung everywhere. But one of the rooms particularly caught my attention. Room 23. Its door was locked and a prohibition sign hung in front of it. I asked one of the nurses about the room, but she evaded my question. Her gaze turned cold and she quickly changed the subject. The fact that she didn't want to talk about it only made me more curious. What was hidden behind that door? Later that day, I noticed that room 23 was the only area the staff avoided. No one spoke about it, no one went near it. It was as if the room harbored some kind of curse that repelled anyone who approached it. On the following night, the whispers grew more intense. They seemed to come from the walls, from the depths of the building. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my name as if someone was whispering directly into my ear. It was a sound that sent an icy shiver down my spine. I tossed and turned in bed, trying to ignore the sound. But it wouldn't let me go. It was as if the voices were calling to me, trying to lure me into the darkness. The urge to follow them grew stronger with every minute. In a moment of courage, I sat up and looked into the darkness of the room, but there was nothing, only the shadows moving on the walls as if they had a life of their own. That night, I knew I was not alone in this hospital. The next day, a new nurse approached my bed. She seemed nervous and kept looking over her shoulder as if she was afraid of being overheard. After examining me, she leaned down and whispered, "Don't listen to the voices, they lie." Before I could react, she had already disappeared. Her words gave me no peace. What did she mean? Why shouldn't I listen to the voices? The fact that she left so quickly made me suspect she knew more than she was willing to admit. The voices in my head grew louder and clearer. They whispered secrets, things I shouldn't know. The thought that something was wrong in this hospital became clearer and clearer, and I knew I would soon find out the truth. The shadows in my room began to take on forms. They seemed to move even when there was no light to cast them. Sometimes I felt they were watching me, as if they were living beings hiding in the corners of the room. Once, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed, but when I looked, there was nothing, only the darkness and the faint silhouette of the furniture. I wondered if the medication they were giving me was deceiving my senses. During the night, the feeling intensified. The shadows moved, grew, and receded as if they wanted to play with me. I tried to stay calm, but the panic within me grew. Something dark was in this hospital, and I felt it was waiting for me. The staff's behavior became increasingly strange. They whispered to each other, gave me worried glances, and seemed constantly nervous. Whenever I entered the hallway, the conversations abruptly ceased. It was as if I was something that shouldn't be talked about. Once I heard two nurses talking about the shadow. They spoke in hushed tones and kept looking around as if they were afraid of being overheard. When I approached, they immediately broke off their conversation and looked at me as if I were the ghost they were talking about. My curiosity grew immeasurably. What was this secret that everyone was trying so carefully to hide, and why did I feel it had something to do with me? I knew I had to find out what was going on here before it was too late. A few nights later, a sound from one of the neighboring rooms woke me up. It sounded like scratching, as if someone was trying to break through the walls. When I got up and went to the door, it stopped. Only silence greeted me when I looked into the hallway. I approached the room from which the sound had come, but when I looked inside, it was empty. The bed was unmade, the blankets rumpled, as if someone had just been lying there. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, even though the windows were closed. A strange feeling of déjà vu came over me. Had I been here before? The walls seemed to be surrounded by a dark aura, as if they carried something evil within them. I knew I should avoid this place, but curiosity was stronger than fear. That night I woke up and felt I was not alone. In the faint moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the end of my bed. It was dark, its face unrecognizable. I held my breath, unable to move or scream. The figure did not move, yet I felt its presence heavy and oppressive. My thoughts raced. Was it a patient who had sneaked in, or was it something else, something I couldn't explain? My fear grew as I stared in its direction. Then, without warning, it vanished just like that. I was alone in the room, but the shiver on my skin remained. I knew what I had seen was real. Something was haunting me, something not of this world. The strange occurrences increased. Once, while sitting in my room, the book I was reading suddenly fell from my hands. It was simply ripped from my fingers as if an invisible force had pushed it away. The book landed on the floor with a dull thud. My heart stopped for a moment. I picked up the book and saw that the pages were torn, as if someone had flipped through them with great anger. But no one else had been in the room. Whatever it was, it wanted me to be afraid, and it succeeded. I couldn't sleep anymore, could barely eat. Everything in this hospital screamed to drive me insane, and I knew I was well on my way there if I didn't find a way out soon. One night I was awakened by screams. They came from a distance, echoing through the corridors. Chilling my blood, it was a scream full of pain, despair, and indescribable fear. I sat bolt upright in bed, unable to move. The scream repeated, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded as if someone was trapped in the deepest abysses of hell, crying for release. I wanted to get up to see what was happening, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed with fear. When the screams suddenly stopped, the silence was even more disturbing. It felt as if the entire hospital was holding its breath. I knew I would never forget those screams, that they were burned into my memory, and I knew I would soon find out what had caused them. The next morning I made a decision. I could no longer stand by idly as the darkness spread around me. I had to find out what was going on here. Somewhere in this hospital there had to be answers, and I was determined to find them. I began to talk to other patients, trying to hear their stories, but most of them were either too disturbed or too frightened to talk to me. It was as if they all followed an unspoken pact that said one should not talk about things in this hospital. Finally, I found an older patient who was willing to tell me something. With a trembling voice, he spoke of the shadows that wandered through the corridors, looking for souls they could drag into the darkness. His words sent an icy shiver down my spine, but they brought me a step closer to the truth. During my search for answers, I discovered an area of the hospital that was locked, an entire wing that apparently hadn't been used for years. The door was secured with a heavy lock, and warning signs proclaimed that entry was strictly forbidden. My curiosity was aroused. Why was this area locked? What was hidden behind it? I asked the staff about it, but they only gave me evasive answers or pretended not to know what I was talking about. It was obvious that they were hiding something. One night I sneaked there. I knew it was risky, but I had to find out the truth. As I stood before the locked door, I felt an uncanny coldness that seemed to come from inside the wing. I placed my hand on the door, and at that moment I knew I was touching something very dark and dangerous. In my search for answers, I came across a room where old files were kept. They were stacks of patient records dating back to the 1930s. I began to leaf through them, looking for clues as to what was going on in this hospital. The more I read, the more I realized that this hospital had a dark past. Patients had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some of them had reported strange occurrences before they mysteriously died. Their stories resembled what I had experienced myself. One of the reports caught my attention. It spoke of a patient who claimed to be pursued by shadows. He described them as dark figures that haunted him at night, whispering to him to come to them. His report ended abruptly, and the last word he had written was Room 23. The atmosphere in the hospital became increasingly tense. One morning I noticed that a patient was missing. It was the old man who had told me about the shadows. When I asked the staff about him, they just said he had been discharged, but something in their tone told me that wasn't the whole truth. I couldn't help but believe that his disappearance had something to do with the shadows. Had they taken him? Had he disappeared into the darkness as he had described? The idea haunted me, and I began to search for answers even more intensely. That night I heard the screams again. This time they sounded closer, more insistent. I felt they were coming from room 23. That the old man was there crying for help, but I was too scared to check. I stayed in my bed, unable to move, while the screams drove me insane. I learned about a ritual that could appease the shadows. It was an ancient practice that had been performed by former patients to protect themselves from the spirits that haunted this hospital. The ritual was hidden in the old files I had found. The ritual required certain steps that had to be performed at full moon. It involved drawing symbols and speaking old words written in a foreign language. I didn't understand everything, but I was desperate enough to try. The following night, I performed the ritual. I drew the symbols on the floor of my room and spoke the words as best I could. But as I spoke the words, I felt the darkness closing in around me. The shadows on the walls seemed to move towards me as if they were angry. I felt I had made a mistake. After the ritual, something unexpected happened. During the night, I woke up and saw the figure again that had previously stood at the end of my bed, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. It looked like a man with long, thin limbs and a face veiled by a deep darkness. He spoke. His voice was a hiss that cut through the darkness. "You have opened something that would have been better left closed," he said. "Now you are one of us." The words echoed in my head, and I felt a cold grip around my heart. The figure dissolved and disappeared into the darkness, but its words remained. What had I done? Had I conjured the shadows by performing the ritual, or was I always destined to become a part of them? The thoughts tormented me, and I knew I would soon learn the full truth. The nights became increasingly unbearable. The shadows became more aggressive, moving in my room and reaching for me. It felt as if they wanted to drag me into the darkness to make me one of them. Their touches were cold, and I felt them draining my energy. One night, when the shadows were particularly strong, I felt them holding me tightly, dragging me into the darkness. I struggled, screamed, but there was no one to help me. The room grew colder and colder, and I felt my breath freezing into ice crystals. Then suddenly it was over, the shadows disappeared, and I lay gasping on my bed. But I knew it was only a matter of time until they came back. And next time they would drag me entirely into their world without me being able to resist. I knew I had to escape from this hospital before it was too late. I began to devise a plan to escape unnoticed. The staff seemed to constantly watch me as if they knew what I was up to, so I had to be careful. One night, when the hospital was particularly quiet, I sneaked out of my room. I moved silently through the corridors, always careful to avoid the shadows. My heart raced, and I knew this was my only chance. But as I reached the exit door, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned around and saw one of the shadows directly behind me. Its face was a void, a black hole that wanted to drag me into the darkness. I ran as fast as I could, but the shadow followed me closer and closer, faster and faster. I knew I couldn't escape. The shadows had me, and there was no turning back. One night, as I was again awakened by the whispers, the figure stood at the end of my bed. This time I knew there was no point in fleeing. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "You opened the door," it said. "Now you are part of our world. You belong to us." I felt the darkness enveloping me, the cold penetrating my body. The figure came closer, placed its cold hand on my forehead. "See you on the other side," it whispered, and at that moment I knew my fate was sealed. The next morning I was found unconscious in my room. They brought me to another wing of the hospital, far away from room 23. But the shadows did not let me go. I could still see them, hear them, feel them. They had become a part of me, and I knew they would never let me go again. I learned that the hospital had a dark history. It had once been an asylum for prisoners of war where terrible experiments had been conducted. Many of the patients had suffered under cruel conditions and had died. Their spirits were still trapped here in the walls of the building. I was just another patient who had experienced the darkness of this place, and I knew I would not be the last. The shadows would always be here, always looking for new souls they could drag into their world, and I was now one of them. In the days that followed, I fell into a deep silence. My words failed as if the shadows had stolen them. No one seemed to notice or understand my suffering. The hospital was filled with oppressive normalcy while a storm raged within me. I tried to talk to the doctors to convince them of the shadows, but they didn't listen to me, taking my words as symptoms of my condition. They prescribed stronger medications, but these only made the voices louder, the shadows more intense. In this silence, I felt more alone than ever before. The shadows watched me, they waited. I felt that the moment would come when they would take me and that no one would be there to save me. The days passed, but the presence in my room remained. It was an invisible force that accompanied me day and night. I couldn't see it, yet I felt it with every movement, every breath. Sometimes I heard clicking and scratching as if something was crawling across the floor. It felt as if an invisible veil lay over, pressing me down, enveloping me. Every night was a struggle, a fight for every breath. I tried to talk to other patients about it, but they remained silent or evaded my questions. Some just looked at me strangely and from then on avoided all contact with me. It was as if they knew what I was hearing but were too frightened to speak about it out loud. In this silence lay an unspoken truth that was worse than any nightmare. One night, as I was again awakened by the whispers, the realization hit me like a blow. The shadows were not simply ghosts or apparitions, they were the essence of madness itself, born from the darkness of the human soul. The shadows were a part of us, of everyone who had ever come to this hospital. They fed on our fear, on our suffering. They were the embodiment of the horror that lurked in each of us. And now they were also a part of me. I knew there was no escape. The shadows would always be with me, living inside me. Haunting me, they were my own darkness, and I couldn't defeat them. Madness had finally seized me. On the last night, I felt my time had come. The shadows were everywhere around me, enclosing me. They whispered to me, luring me into their world. I felt the darkness spreading within me, feeling like a cold, oppressive fog. I surrendered to the whispers, letting the shadows drag me into the depths. It was as if I was falling into a dark abyss, without bottom, without end. The darkness enveloped me, taking my breath away, yet I felt a strange calm in that moment. I knew I couldn't fight anymore. I had become a part of the shadows, one with the darkness. They had taken me and I had surrendered to them. In the darkness, I found the only kind of peace I would ever know. The next morning, only my lifeless body was found in the room. The doctors could not determine the cause of my death. It was as if my life had simply been sucked out of me, as if the darkness had devoured me. But that was not the end, for I knew I was still there in the shadows, in the darkness that permeated the hospital. I was now a part of them, a ghost wandering the corridors, searching for the next soul to join us. The darkness was now a part of this place, and it would always be here. The shadows would continue to whisper, continue to hunt, and they would always be hungry, always searching for more, for in the darkness there was no peace. Only endless, relentless horror. When I was admitted to the old hospital, I had no idea what to expect. It was a dilapidated building that had long since seen its best days. The walls were damp, the plaster crumbled, and a foul odor hung in the air. I was taken to a wing that seemed less used. The windows were boarded up and the light was dim and flickering. The thought of being in this gloomy place made me nervous, but I had no other choice. My family had insisted that I seek help here. On that first night, I found it difficult to sleep. The mattress was hard and the pillow smelled musty, but it wasn't just the physical discomfort that kept me awake. It was the feeling that something was wrong, that something dark and inexplicable lay over this place. On the second day, I noticed a door at the end of the corridor that was different from the others. It was smaller and looked like a door to a child's room. A strange feeling came over me as I approached. The door was not locked, and I could catch a quick glimpse inside. The room beyond was tiny, and the light only fell through a narrow crack in the wall. There was a small bed, some old toys, and pictures hanging from the walls. But the room seemed abandoned, as if no one had set foot in it for a long time. I asked a nurse about this room, but she just shook her head and hurried on. Her behavior made me even more curious. Why was there a child's room in a psychiatric hospital? And why was it so deserted and forgotten? On the third night, I heard it for the first time, the laughter of a child. It was a soft, giggling sound that echoed through the corridors. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Why would a child be in a hospital like this? But the laughter repeated, this time clearer. I sat up and listened. The laughter seemed to come from the direction of the child's room. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't help but get up and follow the sound. The door to the child's room was open, and a faint light flickered inside. I entered, but the room was empty. Only the old toys lay still and dusty on the floor. The laughter had ceased, and an oppressive silence filled the air. I turned around and went back to my room, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't let me go. In the following nights, I heard more sounds. It wasn't just the laughter, but also the soft whimpering of a child and scratching, as if something was creeping across the floor. The sounds always seemed to come from the child's room, and every time I checked, the room was empty. I began to talk to the other patients about the child's room, but they seemed to know nothing about it or pretended they had never seen it. Some just looked at me strangely and thereafter avoided all contact with me. It was as if they knew what I was hearing but were too afraid to talk about it. The sounds intensified. It was as if the child I heard was in distress, as if it was calling for help. But every time I approached the child's room, the sound retreated, hiding in the shadows. I no longer knew if it was real or just a product of my imagination. One evening, a nurse I hadn't seen before came into my room. She seemed nervous and kept looking around as if she was afraid someone might overhear us. After examining me, she leaned down and whispered, "Stay away from the child's room." I wanted to ask her why, but she just put a finger to her lips and hastily left the room. Her warning deeply troubled me. What did she mean? Was the child's room dangerous, and why should I stay away from it? That night, I heard the laughter again, but it sounded different. It was distorted, eerie, and sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stayed in my bed, too frightened to move. The nurse's words echoed in my head. Yet curiosity began to gnaw at me. The next morning, I decided to examine the child's room more closely. As I entered, I noticed an old picture on the wall that I hadn't seen before. It showed a group of children smiling at the camera, but their eyes were empty and looked uncanny. I stepped closer to examine it. The children wore clothes from another era, old-fashioned and worn. In the background, I could make out a shadow that looked like a figure. It was difficult to discern, but it seemed as if someone was standing in the shadow, watching the children. A strange feeling came over me and I stepped back. The picture looked alive, as if the children were looking at me. It was as if they wanted to lure me into the room, as if they wanted to share a secret with me, but I knew that this secret was something that should better remain hidden. One of the children I had seen in the picture began to appear in my dreams. It was a little girl with blonde curls and a white dress. She always stood at the end of a dark corridor and looked at me with sad eyes. Every night she seemed to come closer. One morning the picture was gone. I searched the entire room for it, but it was as if it had never been there. A cold shiver ran down my spine and I felt that something terrible had happened. The child who had visited me in my dreams had disappeared, as if she had been pulled into the darkness. The atmosphere in the hospital became gloomier. The other patients seemed to feel it too. They became quieter, looked at me suspiciously as if they knew I had seen something I shouldn't have seen. I began to realize that the child's room was more than just an abandoned room. A few days later, I noticed that the toys in the child's room were disappearing. They had previously been scattered on the floor, dusty and abandoned, but now they were gone one by one. Only an old stuffed animal remained, a torn bear sitting in the corner. I asked the staff if they had removed the toys, but no one could remember seeing them. It was as if they had never existed, but I knew they had been there. I had touched them, had seen their decaying condition. The feeling that something uncanny was happening intensified. The sounds from the child's room grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the toys were part of the haunting, as if they themselves were possessed by the spirit of the child who lived in that room. One night, as I heard the laughter again, I ventured back into the child's room. The room was dark, only the faint moonlight penetrated through the crack in the wall. But this time something was different. In the light, I saw a small figure standing in the corner. It was the girl from my dreams in her white dress with blonde curls. She stood there and looked at me with her sad eyes. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the cold envelop me. I wanted to say something, but no words came to my lips. The figure did not move. She just stood there as if waiting for something. Then suddenly she dissolved, disappearing into the darkness of the room. I was left alone with the knowledge that I had just encountered a ghost, a child trapped in this room. The next day, I discovered an old mirror lying in the child's room. It was dusty and covered with a cloth, as if someone didn't want anyone to look into it. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear, and I removed the cloth. The mirror was old and cracked, but I could see my own face in it. But it wasn't just my reflection I saw. In the background behind me, I could see the figure of the girl. She stood there in her white dress and smiled at me, but her smile was cold, empty. I turned around, but the room behind me was empty. When I looked back into the mirror, the girl was gone. The shiver that ran down my spine made me hastily put the mirror back. It was as if the mirror created a connection to the world beyond life, a bridge to the ghosts that haunted this hospital. In the following nights, I heard the child laugh, but it sounded different. It was not a joyful laugh, but a dark, cold giggle that echoed through the corridors. It sounded as if the child was playing with something that lived in the shadows. I saw the shadows dancing on the walls, moving as if they had a life of their own. They formed shapes that looked like children chasing and playing with each other, but the game seemed uncanny, menacing, as if they wanted to pull me into their game. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the shadows, but they were everywhere. They enveloped me, pulling me into their darkness. It was as if the child's room was a portal to another world, a world of shadows, of lost souls. And I knew I would soon be a part of this world if I wasn't careful. One afternoon, when I went back into the child's room, I discovered an old diary under the bed. It was dusty and the pages were yellowed. I opened it and began to read. The entries were written in a childlike handwriting and told the story of a little girl who had lived in this hospital. She wrote about the other children, the games they played, and the nurses who cared for them. But the further I read, the darker the entries became. The girl spoke of a shadow that visited her at night, of a game she played with it. The last entry was particularly disturbing. The girl wrote that the shadow would come for her, that it wanted to bring her into its world. She was afraid, but she knew she couldn't escape. The entry ended abruptly, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. After reading the diary, I spoke to one of the older patients who had lived in this hospital for a long time. He had a wrinkled face and dim eyes, but when I asked him about the child's room, he seemed to know what I was talking about. "They are still here," he said in a shaky voice. "The children, the ghosts, they are in the walls, in the shadows. They are still playing their game." His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Don't go into that room," he warned me. "It will take you." I wanted to know more, but the old man fell silent and turned away. His words had deeply disturbed me. Whatever was in that child's room, it wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker, something I couldn't understand. That night, I decided to lock the child's room. I could feel the girl's presence, the shadows lurking around me. It was as if the room itself was a living entity reaching for me, wanting to drag me into its world. I found an old key in a nurse's office and locked the door to the child's room. It felt like a victory, a small triumph over the darkness lurking in that room, but deep inside I knew it wasn't that easy to banish the ghosts. That night I slept better, but in my dreams I saw the child again. She stood before the locked door, her eyes full of sadness. "You can't stop us," she whispered. "We will always be here." I woke up drenched in sweat and knew she was right. I decided to leave the hospital. I couldn't bear it anymore, this constant presence, this darkness that haunted me. I asked the doctors to discharge me, but they said I wasn't ready. They considered my words about the child's room as hallucinations. One night I tried to sneak out of the hospital. I crept through the dark corridors, always careful not to draw attention. My heart raced and I felt the darkness surrounding me. I knew it wouldn't let me go. As I reached the entrance hall, the little girl stood before me. She held a doll in her hand and smiled at me. "You can't go," she said in a soft voice. "You belong to us now." A cold grip took hold of my heart and I felt trapped. After realizing I couldn't escape, I decided to face the child. I went back into the child's room, even though every instinct in me screamed not to, but I had to know what it wanted from me. The girl stood in the middle of the room. She looked at me with her big, sad eyes. "Why are you here?" I asked. "What do you want from me?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, clutching her doll tightly. Then suddenly she moved towards me, her eyes filled with tears, and I could see the pain in them. "We are trapped," she whispered. "You have to help us." In that moment, I felt pity and despair. She was a ghost, a lost child, trapped in the darkness of this place. The cold in the child's room became unbearable. It was as if the walls themselves were sucking the life out of me. The temperature dropped, and I could see my own breath rising in white clouds before my face. The darkness seemed to thicken, as if it wanted to devour me. I felt the presence of the child surrounding me, passing through me. It was as if she wanted to show me something, to tell me something I couldn't understand. The cold penetrated my bones, and I felt as if I were trapped in an ice cage. In the distance, I heard the laughter again, but this time it was different. It was no longer laughter, it was weeping, a sobbing that echoed through the walls. It was as if the child was finally showing her sorrow, her loneliness, and I knew I had to do something to help her. I remembered the child's diary and the ritual she described. It was an old, strange ritual that supposedly protected them from the shadows. I knew it was risky, but I was willing to try. Perhaps this was the only way to help the child. I prepared the ritual as best I could. I drew the symbols on the floor of the child's room, lit candles, and murmured the words that were in the diary. The air around me grew heavy, and I felt the darkness closing in on me. The child appeared before me, her eyes fixed on the symbols. "Help us," she whispered, "free us." I spoke the last words of the ritual, and at that moment an eerie scream broke through the silence. It was as if the darkness itself screamed, as if it resisted. The darkness in the room swirled around me, forming shapes that glided towards me. I saw the shadows, saw the faces of the children trapped within them. They fought, they screamed, they tried to free themselves. I kept my eyes closed, focusing on the ritual. I felt the cold surrounding me, felt the pressure weighing on me. It was as if the darkness itself was fighting against me, as if it wanted to devour me, but I persevered. I spoke the words again and again until I felt the darkness recede. The cold withdrew and I felt the figures dissolve, the shadows retreat. The room grew brighter and I knew I had succeeded. The moment the darkness vanished, I saw the child before me. She smiled, and in her eyes I saw gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "you have freed us." She dissolved, disappearing into a ray of light that illuminated the room. I sank to my knees, exhausted and relieved. The cold was gone and the room suddenly felt warm and peaceful. I felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I had freed the child and with her myself, but I knew the darkness was still out there somewhere. It had only been temporarily banished, but the child's room was now empty and I could finally find peace knowing I had done something good. The next day, as I walked through the corridor, I noticed that the atmosphere had changed. It was quieter, more peaceful. The darkness that had previously been so omnipresent seemed to have disappeared. It was as if the hospital itself had sighed with relief, as if a curse had been lifted from it. I looked back at the child's room. The door was closed, and I knew it was better that way. The room was empty, freed from the spirits that had inhabited it. Yet I knew this was only a small victory, that the darkness still lurked somewhere in the shadows. I felt a strange calm within me. I had freed the child, brought her peace, and in that moment I knew it had been the right thing to do, that I had done something good. But the memory of the child, of the laughter and the weeping, would always stay with me. In the days that followed, I often wondered if it had all really happened. Had I really seen a child freed a ghost, or was it just a product of my imagination, of my own madness? The doctors seemed to notice nothing, and no one spoke about the child's room. But deep inside, I knew it had been real. I had seen the child, had spoken to her, had freed her. The darkness I had felt had been real, and I had fought against it. It was a reality I could not deny, no matter how much I wanted to. The question of reality tormented me, but I knew the answer was unimportant. What mattered was that I had made a difference, that I had brought peace to the child, and that was enough to get me through the days, to give me the strength to carry on. A few days later, I had one last encounter with the child. It was in a dream, or perhaps it was more than that. She stood in a ray of light. The room around her was warm and peaceful. She looked at me, and in her eyes was an expression of gratitude and peace. "Thank you," she said softly, "you have freed us." Then she turned and walked into the light, disappearing into a brightness that filled me with a feeling of peace. I knew she was finally free, that she had found her peace. I woke up with a feeling of calm, with the knowledge that I had done something good. The child was gone, and with her the darkness that had haunted me for so long. It was a farewell, but also a new beginning. I could finally let go. I could finally find peace. After this experience, a new chapter began in my life. I was discharged from the hospital and returned home. But the memory of the child's room, of the child I had freed, remained with me. They were a part of me, a part of my story. I tried to rebuild my life, to return to normal, but the experiences had changed me. I saw the world differently, saw the shadows lurking within it. But I had also learned that one could fight against darkness, that one could defeat it. The child and the child's room were now in the past, but they had taught me an important lesson. They had shown me that there was always a way to defeat darkness, that one could always make a difference, no matter how small. Although the child's room was now a part of my past, it remained alive in my thoughts. The memories of the child, of the darkness I had fought, would always be a part of me. They were a testament to what I had experienced and a constant companion in my life. Sometimes in quiet moments I heard the child's laughter, felt her presence in the air. But it was no longer an eerie laugh, no cold giggle. It was the laughter of a child who had found peace, who had been freed, and in those moments I knew I had done something good, that I had made a difference. The child's room was now empty, but its story would live on in me and in the memories of what I had experienced. It was a part of me, and it would always remain a part of me. My first shift as a night watchman in the old psychiatric hospital began quietly. The corridors were dark and still, only the hum of the fluorescent lights accompanied me. It was a job I had taken because I thought it would be easy, just a few extra shifts, but I would soon find out I was mistaken. I was instructed to stay near the night nurse's room, a small room at the end of the long corridor. It was furnished with old furniture and served as a break room farthest. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, and the room smelled of damp and old books. The nurses I met seemed worried and tired, as if they hadn't slept for days. They gave me few instructions before leaving the area. It was clear they didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. An uneasy feeling came over me, but I attributed it to my own nervousness. During my first rounds through the hospital, I noticed a wing that was secured with a heavy padlock. A large sign warned, "No entry, authorized personnel only." The lock was old and rusty, and the entire area seemed to have been untouched for years. I asked one of the older nurses about it, but she ignored my question and changed the subject. Her reaction was strange, as if the topic was too painful or too dangerous to talk about. Her silence only made me more curious, but I knew I wouldn't get answers easily. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that wing. It was as if an invisible presence hovered over this area. The air was heavy and oppressive. The few patients I saw on my rounds didn't even look in that direction, as if they knew something was lurking there. On my third night shift, I heard the sounds for the first time. It started as a faint whisper, barely perceptible, drifting through the corridor. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing. The corridor lay still and deserted before me. Only the hum of the lights was audible. The whisper came again, this time louder, as if someone was standing right next to me, murmuring in a foreign language. I turned around, but there was no one. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the corridor itself was alive. I tried to ignore the sound and continue my rounds, but the whisper wouldn't let me go. It was always there, always nearby, as if it was watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't say what it was, but I knew it meant nothing good. One of the next nights, I heard a crackling sound from the walkie-talkie in the night nurse's room. It was an old device that was rarely used, but that evening it suddenly sprang to life. A static and crackling noise sounded, followed by a faint, incomprehensible murmur. I held the device to my ear and listened. The voice was faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, or perhaps it was just sounds that made no sense. But amidst the murmuring, I clearly heard my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I hastily put the walkie-talkie back. Whatever it was, it knew who I was, and it was here in this room with me. I felt an invisible presence watching me, and I knew I wasn't alone that night. One night, while on duty with a colleague, she suddenly disappeared. We had been walking through the corridors together when she said she had to get something from the storage room. I waited for her, but she didn't return. After a while, I went looking for her. I found her flashlight on the floor, but there was no trace of her. The storage room was empty, and there were no signs that she had been there. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to move, as if it was mocking her disappearance. I reported her disappearance to the doctors, but they didn't seem surprised. "It happens here sometimes," one of them said with a resigned sigh. "You get used to it." Their indifference was disturbing, as if the disappearance of a person in this hospital was something normal. Since my colleague's disappearance, I had the feeling that the hospital was getting colder. It was a coldness that didn't come from the broken heating, but seemed to emanate from the walls. From the darkness lurking in every corner, it penetrated my bones, making me shiver and tremble. I noticed that the temperature dropped most sharply near the night nurse's room. The room itself seemed to be the source of this cold, as if it harbored something dark and uncanny within it. The air was heavy and smelled musty, and I could see my own breath as white clouds. The patients also seemed affected by the cold. They shivered and retreated into their beds, muttering quietly to themselves. It was as if the entire hospital was trapped in an ice cage, as if the darkness held us all in its icy grip. One night in the night nurse's room, I discovered a drawer full of old records. They were reports and notes dating back to the 1920s. Curious, I began to leaf through them. The stories they told were terrifying. The records spoke of strange incidents, of patients who disappeared without a trace, of apparitions seen in the corridors. There were reports of strange noises, of screams coming from the forbidden wing. Some of the notes were covered with frantic scribbles, as if the author had lost their mind. One of the last records particularly caught my eye. It spoke of a curse that lay upon the hospital, a curse connected to an old ritual. The details were unclear, but it seemed that the night nurse's room was the key to this curse. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I knew I had to find out more. In the following nights, I began to notice strange behavior in the patients. They were restless, muttering to themselves, and seemed to be in a trance. Some of them simply stared into the void, as if they saw something invisible to me. A patient who was housed near the night nurse's room began to scratch at the walls. He spoke of shadows chasing him, of figures coming out of the walls and reaching for him. His fingernails were broken and bloodstains covered the wall, but he didn't stop. The staff dismissed his behavior as madness, but I knew it was more. The cold, the sounds, the whispers, all of it seemed connected to the night nurse's room. It was as if the room itself was influencing the patients, as if it was driving them insane. One night, I had a dream that took my breath away. I was in the night nurse's room, but it was different. The walls were blood red, and dark figures crawled out of the corners, coming towards me. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes were empty, as if they could see me but didn't really perceive me. In the middle of the room stood an old bed, and on it lay a man bound and gagged. He screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. The dark figures reached for him, pulling him into the depths, into the darkness that lurked under the bed. He disappeared, and I was left alone, surrounded by the cold and the silence. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dream had been so real, so tangible that for a moment I didn't know if I was awake or still caught in a nightmare. I only knew one thing: the night nurse's room was the key to all of this, and it hid something that was better left undiscovered. The next day I noticed an old mirror in the night nurse's room that I hadn't noticed before. It was large and stood in a corner of the room, half hidden by a curtain. The frame was ornate, but the mirror itself was dusty and tarnished, as if it hadn't been used for years. I stepped closer and wiped away the dust. My own reflection appeared, but it was more than that. Behind me I saw a figure, a dark, shadowy figure staring at me. Its face was unrecognizable, only its eyes empty black holes that seemed to stare into my soul. I whirled around, but there was no one. When I looked back into the mirror, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The mirror seemed to be a gate to another world, a world of shadows and darkness, and I knew I had just glimpsed into that world. On a particularly quiet night, I heard a cry for help. It was a faint, plaintive whisper coming from the darkness of the forbidden wing. "Help," it cried, barely more than a whisper. It sounded desperate, full of fear and pain. I hesitated, but then I followed the call. My footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, and I felt the cold enveloping me. The call grew louder, more insistent, as if someone was in great distress. It led me directly to the night nurse's room. When I opened the door, the room was empty, yet the whisper remained. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the darkness itself. "Help," it repeated over and over, and I felt fear rising within me. It was as if the room itself was alive, as if it was reaching for me, wanting to drag me into its darkness. The next day, I decided to take a look into the forbidden wing. I knew I was breaking the rules, but I couldn't help myself. Something drew me there, something I couldn't ignore. The key to the padlock hung unattended on a hook, as if someone wanted me to go inside. I opened the heavy door, and a cold, foul odor hit me. The corridor beyond was dark and seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were damp and the air was thick. It was as if I had taken a step into another world, a world of darkness and oblivion. I walked further, driven by an invisible force. The darkness around me grew thicker, and I felt the cold penetrating me. In the distance, I saw a door half open, and I knew I had to go there. Whatever was there, it was waiting for me. The door at the end of the corridor led into a room that was different from all the others. It was small, barely larger than a cell, and in the middle stood an old, dilapidated bed. The walls were covered with symbols scratched into them, symbols I didn't know, and that sent an icy shiver down my spine. In the corner of the room stood an old, rusty wheelchair. It seemed to have been sitting there untouched for years, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been sitting in it, that someone was watching me from the darkness. The room itself was filled with an inexplicable tension, a darkness that seemed alive. I felt this was the origin, the place where it all began. The cursed room that was the heart of the darkness in this hospital. I knew I should leave it, that I had no business being here, yet something held me fast, wouldn't let me go. It was as if the room itself was trapping me. In the middle of the room, I discovered the remains of an old ritual. Candle stubs, rusty chains, and something that looked like dried blood were arranged around the bed. The symbols on the walls seemed to form a circle, as if they were trapping something in the middle. I remembered the records I had read, the hint of an old ritual. Was this the place where it had taken place? Had they tried to conjure or banish something? The air in the room was heavy and I could barely breathe. It was as if the darkness itself wanted to suffocate me. I touched one of the symbols on the wall, and at that moment I felt a wave of cold flow through my body. A whisper filled the room and I hastily withdrew my hand. Whatever had happened here, it was dark and evil, and I knew I had to stay away from this place. That night I encountered the ghost that haunted this hospital. I was just doing my rounds when I saw a figure in the corridor. It stood at the end of the corridor in a long white dress. Its face was pale and its eyes were empty. I froze, my heart skipped a beat. The figure did not move, yet I felt its gaze on me, penetrating and cold. It was as if it saw right through me, as if it didn't really perceive me. A soft whisper came from its direction, and I knew it was the same ghost I had heard. I wanted to say something, but my voice failed me. The figure raised its hand as if beckoning me. Then suddenly it disappeared, as if it had vanished into thin air, but its gaze remained burned into my memory, and I knew it was watching me, that it was following me. The next day I sought out one of the older doctors. I had to know what was going on here. The doctor looked at me for a long time before he began to speak. "There are things that are better left unsaid," he said softly, "things that rest in darkness and should not be disturbed." I told him about the cursed room, about the ritual I had found. His eyes narrowed and he shook his head. "That's an old curse," he said, "a curse that weighs on this place. Something was conjured, something that doesn't belong in our world." He warned me to stay away from the night nurse's room. "It is the key to all of it," he said, "but it is also the entrance to darkness. If you get too close to it, it will devour you." His words sent shivers down my spine, and I knew I had to decide whether to continue or give up. The following night I had an eerie encounter in the hallway. I was walking along the corridor when suddenly all the lights went out. The darkness was so thick that I couldn't see my hand in front of my eyes. My heart raced, and I felt the cold enveloping me. Then I saw it again, the figure from my dream. It stood in the middle of the hallway, its eyes fixed on me. But this time it was not alone. Behind it, more figures appeared, shadows clinging to the walls, slowly approaching me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The darkness surrounded me and I felt the cold crawling into my bones. The figures came closer, their eyes empty, their faces distorted. In that moment, I knew I was trapped. That the darkness wanted to take me. I knew I couldn't give up. I had to fight, had to confront the darkness. With trembling hands, I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness and the figures recoiled as if blinded by the light. I slowly walked backward, holding the light firmly on the figures. They didn't move, yet I felt their hatred, their anger. It was as if they wanted to pull me into their world, into the darkness that surrounded them. But I knew I couldn't let them take me. Finally, I reached the end of the corridor and ran back to the night nurse's room. The darkness followed me, but I managed to close the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, the light still in my hand. I had survived, yet I knew it wasn't over. I knew I had to complete the ritual to banish the darkness. I gathered all the items I had found in the cursed room and prepared myself. It was risky, but I had no other choice. I had to try to break the curse before it was too late. In the middle of the night nurse's room, I drew the symbols on the floor, lit the candles, and began to murmur the words that were in the old records. The air grew heavy and the cold crept through the room. I felt the darkness closing in on me, enveloping me. I spoke the last words of the ritual. And at that moment, an eerie scream broke through the room. The darkness receded, and I felt something being ripped from my body. The room became bright, and the figures disappeared as if they were burning in the light. I knew I had succeeded, that the curse was broken. After the ritual, an eerie silence returned to the hospital. The cold had vanished, and the darkness that had previously been so omnipresent had dissolved. The corridor was empty, and the night nurse's room suddenly felt warm and inviting. The patients seemed calmer, more relaxed. It was as if a heavy shadow had been lifted from them. Some of them even smiled, something I had never seen before. It was as if the hospital itself sighed with relief, freed from the curse that had plagued it for so long, but deep inside I knew it was only a temporary calm. The darkness was defeated but not destroyed. It lurked somewhere in the shadows, waiting to reappear. But for the moment, it was gone, and that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, I kept asking myself if all of this had really happened. Had I really broken a curse, seen a ghost, or was it just imagination, a product of my own mind gone mad in this eerie place? The doctors and nurses didn't talk about it. It was as if they hadn't noticed anything, as if everything that had happened only existed in my head. The records I had found were gone, and no one seemed to remember the cursed room. I knew I would never truly get the answers to my questions, but deep down I felt it had been real, that I had seen and experienced something beyond understanding, and that was a secret I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I knew I couldn't stay in this hospital any longer. I had to leave, had to get some distance. The darkness might have been defeated, but it had changed something in me, something I couldn't undo. I had to try to start a new life, far away from this place. I quit my job and left the hospital. The last few days were strangely quiet, as if the hospital itself was waving goodbye to me. The patients seemed more peaceful, the corridors less oppressive. It was as if the place had found some kind of peace, at least temporarily. As I left the grounds, I looked back one last time. The old building stood silent in the moonlight, surrounded by shadows. A part of me knew I would never truly be gone, that a part of me would always remain here in the corridors, in the darkness of the night nurse's room. A few months later, I heard rumors that strange things had started again in the hospital. Patients reported shadows in the corridors, eerie sounds at night. It was as if the darkness I had fought had returned, as if the curse had never truly been broken. I knew there was nothing more I could do. The curse was older and stronger than me, and it would always be a part of this place. The darkness had its roots deep in the walls of the hospital, and it would always resurface, just like the ghosts that lived within it. It was a depressing feeling to know that my struggle had been in vain, that the darkness was still there, waiting, lurking, but I had made my peace with it. I had done what I could, and now it was time to move on. I wrote down my experiences as a warning for those who would come after me. The hospital might be a place of healing, but it was also a place of darkness, a place haunted by a curse that could never truly be broken. I knew my words might never be read, that they might gather dust in the archives, just like the old records I had found, but I had to try to capture the truth, even if it remained unheard. The night nurse's room was the key, the entrance to darkness. And as long as it existed, as long as the hospital enclosed the secrets of the past within its walls, darkness would always find a way to return. Although I had left the hospital, the darkness remained a part of me. It was in my dreams, in my thoughts, a constant companion reminding me of what I had seen and experienced. It was a part of the world, a part of me, and it would never truly disappear. I knew darkness could not be defeated. It was a part of being human, a part of the shadows that lurked within each of us. The hospital was just a place where it was particularly strong, where it manifested itself, and perhaps that was the true curse that lay upon it. I have learned to live with the darkness, to accept it. It is a part of me, a part of this world, and as long as places like the hospital exist, it will always be there, waiting, lurking, ready to swallow anyone who comes too close. Darkness is eternal, and it will never truly disappear.